Chapter 12 and verse 12 is a good place to start. Now, David had done his sin secretly, but the Lord is going to do something before all of Israel and under the sun. So David said to Nathan, I've sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, the Lord also has taken away your sin. You shall not die. David was penitent. Psalm 32, Psalm 51 are his penitent prayers. God forgave him. However, because by this deed you have given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, you have destroyed your testimony, the child also that is born to you shall surely die. The child's going to die. Bathsheba conceived a child. That child was born. That child was going to die. Verse 15, so Nathan went to his house. Nathan was the prophet. Then the Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow bore to David, so that he was very sick. A little baby got sick. I think David really wanted that little baby to live, because if the baby lived, it would sort of be a token of forgiveness and grace. But God had forgiven him. He wasn't about to overdo it, and David needed a severe lesson. And so did everybody else who watched the situation. But David wanted the child to live. And I'm sure, like any father, David had a tenderness toward that little child. And so in verse 16, David therefore inquired of God for the child. He was so serious, he fasted, went and lay all night on the ground. He prostrated himself on the ground, didn't eat, all night long begged God to save his baby. And the elders of his household stood beside him in order to raise him up from the ground. But he was unwilling and wouldn't eat food with them. All the people who cared for David surrounded him and said, you've got to get up and you've got to eat. He wouldn't do either. This is a man in profound, intense pain and prayer. Verse 18, it happened on the seventh day that the child died. Servants of David were afraid to tell him. The implication here is he stayed that way over a period of 7 days. We don't know if it was the whole 7 days or every night during the 7 days or what portion of it, but for 7 days he went through this fasting and this mourning and this intercession on behalf of the child in a position of proneness or prostrate on the ground. And they were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, behold, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he didn't listen to our voice. How then can we tell him the child is dead, since he might do himself harm? They saw him so wrought with pain, suffering so profoundly over the anticipated death of this child, that they were afraid that if they told him the child was dead, he might take his own life. In their mind, he had attached his entire sense of well-being to the life of that child. So we just can't tell him. He's liable to do something to himself, harm himself. Verse 19, but when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David perceived the child was dead. Now, this is 7 days of praying and fasting and prone all night, pleading with God. So intense that the servants are afraid to even tell him the child is dead for fear that he might take his own life. They read how serious he was, emotional. So David said to his servants, is the child dead? They said he's dead. Amazing. Verse 20. David arose from the ground, which leads me to believe he'd been there for 7 days. Maybe the most intense example of prayer in the Old Testament. He arose from the ground, washed, anointed himself. Well, what that essentially means is cleaned up. Put on his whatever perfume he used, whatever he put in his hair, combed it, changed his clothes, which indicated that he very likely hadn't for 7 days. And he came into the house of the Lord and he did what? He worshiped. What's going on here? He didn't kill himself. He took a bath. He cleaned up. He went in the house of the Lord and he worshiped. And then he came to his house and he said, hey guys, I'm hungry. So they set before him food, and what did he do? He ate. And you're saying, this is an amazing transformation. And his servants in verse 21 said to him, what is this thing that you've done? We don't get it. While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. And when the child died, you got up and ate. Seems backwards. Well, he said, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me that the child may live. That's normal, isn't it, to pray for the life of the child? I wanted the life of that child. I cherished the life of that child. I wanted that little one. I wanted the life of that little one. Even though born of sin, I wanted to love that child and to raise that child and enjoy that child. And so I prayed. And I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me that the child may live. I don't know. He's very much like us, isn't he? He just prayed that God would be gracious, but he didn't know what God would choose to do. But, verse 23, now that he has died, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? No. But, here it is. I shall go to him. Isn't that a great statement? It's a parting, but it's only temporary. I'll go to him, but he will not return to me. Nothing to pray for, guys. Nothing to fast about, guys. He can't come back, but I'm going to him. His sorrow was instantaneously replaced by hope when that child died. This is a man of God, in spite of his sins. Face down on the floor for 7 days, mourning and fasting and praying with grief, his sorrow so great that the servants think he might even take his own life. To their shock, when he finds out the baby has died, he stops weeping, gets up, washes, puts on clean clothes, and eats, and says, nothing to be sad about, gentlemen. I shall go to him. David was a believer. David sinned. David was chastened. And David was forgiven. He was God's child. So we know David wasn't saying, I'll meet him in hell. Some people say, well, all he meant was he was going to be buried in the same field. Come on. That's not going to make you clean up and eat. I'm happy that I'll be lying next to him when I'm dead. And some say, well, that child went to hell because he was born of adultery. No child, no one pays for the sins of a parent. Ezekiel 18 makes that absolutely clear. There's only one answer to this whole thing, and that is that David knew where the child was, and he knew there would be a reunion. And here's the key. David knew where he was going. It was David who said, I will be satisfied when I awake in thy likeness. David knew where he was going. He was going into the presence of God. There was no question about that in David's mind. He knew when he died where he would go. Psalm 16. Thou wilt not abandon my soul to the grave, to Sheol. Neither wilt thou allow thy Holy One to undergo decay. Thou wilt make known to me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. In thy right hand there are pleasures forever. David knew he was going into the presence of God where there was eternal joy and eternal pleasure. And if he said, I shall go to him, then he knew where that child was. And David it was who gave us the incredibly wonderful 23rd Psalm, in which David said, surely goodness and loving kindness shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord